Beyond the Badge is brought to you by the Edina Crime Prevention Fund.
Probably about 15 years ago, we were having a picnic, a barbecue for our police association for the families, and we had invited a whole bunch of retirees. And I remember one person called and to RSVP on the phone, Wally Johnson. Wally had been an old detective here, and a lot of the stories somehow involved Wally Johnson working big cases. And Wally was talking to me on the phone, and I asked him, do you have any pictures? Do you have any old stories? And he said, yep, I'll see you in a few weeks at this barbecue, and I have tons of photos. Well, unfortunately, before the barbecue, he passed away, and I never met him. And to this day, we were never able to find those photos he was talking about. And I just realized that the stories, as the people walked out the door, we're losing all this history. So the city was incorporated in 1888. Even though the city goes back that far, the police department didn't start until 1930. So in 1930, they decided the city's starting to grow enough, maybe we need to get a constable or a village marshal. Percy Redpath was the first one in Edina, and then George Weber was in the neighboring community of Morningside, and that was a village, just like Edina was a village at the time. So Percy Redpath, he was a local person, came from a large family, large local family. He basically operated out of his house. Response time was quite a bit different than it is now. When he was out on patrol, there was no radio system, there were no phones. He would just have to check in with the operator to find out if there was anything he needed to know or any calls to respond to. The phone number to the Edina Police Department was Walnut 2151, and it was his home, and his wife would take the calls when he wasn't there. Redpath had a car. He had a 1930 Ford Tudor that he would keep at his home, and he would take it out on patrols, and then he'd go back, and they'd call him out at all hours for something if anything came up. But Percy Redpath was told, we budgeted for about 5 gallons of fuel every day. And, to nowadays, we burn about 60,000 gallons a year, and, we don't limit our patrol based on using the fuel. And so he wasn't patrolling around the clock like we are now.
257 down 2. I'm just...
So the Morningside area was a separate village. It's now incorporated in Edina, and they had a school, and they had a small village council. They went to George Weber, and he was already the janitor at the school. He was the census taker and the water meter reader. And they said, well, we're going to add police duties. That's now part of your job. George Weber was kind of a character. There were some old articles that talked about if a car was driving too fast down France Avenue, he'd pull out his little 6-shooter and fire a couple rounds in the air. There was also some stories of when he would go to a house of a suicidal person and just walk right down in the basement and pull up a chair and sit down and start talking to them while they got a gun in their hand. And he talked them out of it, but times have changed a lot, and we obviously don't approach things the same way. There was a little bit of that old-fashioned policing in him. And as the community eventually, when Morningside was absorbed by Edina, we took over the police patrols, and then Weber Park is actually named after George Weber in that small little confined area. About 1937, they added a second person. Percy Redpath had passed away. They replaced him with Ted Tilley and Bob Miskey. Then they continued to patrol Edina. So Hilding, and he went by the nickname Ding, was hired in 1937 as an officer. He had been our longest serving officer, and they retired Badge 1, which was his badge. And then later Mike Lutz took his spot on the department, and Mike is now our longest serving officer when he retired in 2016. So sometimes, the history repeats itself with people like that, of these longtime detectives. In about 1942, they decided let's get a permanent structure here. It had been in homes up until that point. For a little while, it was in a place called the Edina Garage, where they just parked the squad car, had a little desk and a phone there. So about 1942, they realized, we're growing enough, we need a police station. By 1947, they'd grown to 6 people, getting round-the-clock coverage at that point. And so what they did is they built almost like just a basement that later they could put a second level, but they never did. And what happened in 1942 was we're just the start of World War II in that era. And so, times are tough. They're not spending a lot of money on things and back home. And so they had this small little basement and they worked out of that for many years until about 1954 when they built what was our long-standing police and city hall. And in the early days, it was also the fire station. And so they moved over to that building, raised the small basement that they had. That became the site of the Edina Library for decades. And then in 2004 is when they basically leveled all of that and built the building we're in now. Important part about knowing our history is they say you can't know where you want to go unless you know where you've been. And so as a supervisor, I meet with the shift once a year and we talk about what our goals are for the year. And the two things that I tell them I really want them to push the envelope on is domestic abuse arrests and DWI. And the reason is because I look back in our history and I can see how that's had such a negative effect on the community. There was a sergeant when he retired, Steve Marson. He was known for making a lot of DWI arrests. And he told me, he said, when I look over my career, he says, I can think of a lot more people I've seen die at the hands of a drunk driver than I have in violent street crimes. And so that old history piece kind of resonates now moving forward when we look at what's going to be our priorities.
Beyond the Badge is brought to you by the Edina Crime Prevention Fund.